The struggle Naomi Carter rose before dawn, as she always did, to the sound of rain tapping against the cracked window of her small apartment. The city outside was still dark, the street lamps flickering faintly, their weak glow bouncing off puddles on the sidewalk. She moved quietly, not because there was anyone else to disturb, but because quiet had become her habit and instinct. Learned from years of working jobs where silence was considered respect, in the corner of the room, her 1-year-old daughter, Amara, shifted in her crib made from secondhand wood, a thin blanket pulled up to her chin. Naomi leaned over, pressing a kiss to her baby's warm forehead, whispering, "Mama's here. Love, we'll get through today." The words were not just for Amara, they were for Naomi herself. A daily promise that somehow, some way, the impossible weight of life would not crush her spirit. The day had already begun with a problem. The community daycare she relied on had closed suddenly that week because of staff shortages. The one neighbor she sometimes asked for help was working a double shift at the hospital, and Naomi knew without question that her employer, the staff, at the Grand Reed Estate had little tolerance for disruptions. Rules were rules. The staff handbook spelled it out clearly: no distractions, no children, no excuses. She had read those words many times, the bold type printed like a warning across the page. She carried those rules in her head like shadows. Every morning, as she scrubbed, dusted, polished, and bent herself to the will of a house that was not hers. But what was she supposed to do? Leave her child alone? Trust the streets? That was unthinkable. Naomi dressed Amara in her best little outfit, a soft cream sweater with a faded pink ribbon tied carefully in her curls. The ribbon wasn't new, just cut from an old dress Naomi once wore in better times, but tied into Amara's dark hair. It looked like a small crown. She warmed a bottle of milk, checked her work uniform twice, then wrapped her daughter in a blanket to shield her from the cold drizzle. Carrying Amara close to her chest, she stepped into the wet morning and walked toward the bus stop, every step echoing the tension in her chest. The bus ride itself told two different stories of the city. On one side of the windows, Naomi saw cracked sidewalks, corner shops, advertising cash only and peeling paint, and the tired faces of workers hurrying toward their shifts. On the other side, as the bus moved into the wealthier district, lawns appeared that looked like they had been cut with rulers, security gates lined with cameras, and mansions made of glass and stone where silence and order reigned. Naomi always felt the shift deep in her stomach, as though she were traveling between two worlds. When one world survival was a daily question, the other wealth insulated life from the menaces of struggle. Today, she would be crossing that border with her daughter in her arms. When the bus finally stopped at the corner of the Reed Estate, Naomi held Amara tighter, her heartbeat quickening. The mansion loomed ahead, a monument of marble and glass framed by gardens so precise they looked painted. Lights glowed softly along the paths, and Naomi could already see the silhouettes of uniformed staff moving inside. She slipped quickly. Through the back entrance, the one reserved for employees, her shoes squeaking faintly on the polished tiles. In the kitchen, the smell of coffee was already brewing, and the chef muttered instructions under his breath. Naomi laid a small blanket on the floor near the corner and gently set Amara down, handing her a shiny pot lid to play with. The sound would keep her busy, she hoped, and maybe if luck was with them, no one would notice. Still, Naomi's hands trembled as she picked up her mop and bucket. Every movement she made felt like it carried risk. She thought about what might happen if she were caught, fired instantly, humiliated, maybe blacklisted from the network of staff agencies that kept her barely afloat. And then what? No income, no roof, no security for Amara, she whispered, prayer under her breath, not daring to raise her eyes too high as she scrubbed the hallway floors. Oh, she found herself listening for every sound. Her daughter's giggles echoed faintly against the marble. And though Naomi's heart swelled at the innocence of the sound, fear clutched her throat. This was not a house that welcomed laughter. This was a house that demanded silence, order, and efficiency. She knew the reputation of its master well, Alexander Reed, the millionaire businessman who had built his fortune through iron discipline and relentless control. was not a man known for kindness. People described him in whispers, brilliant, wealthy, but cold since the loss of his wife. 3 years earlier, Naomi had never spoken to him directly, only glimpsed him at a distance, a tall figure moving briskly through the mansion. A man of few words whose presence alone commanded deference. She reminded herself to focus on the floors, on the steady rhythm of mop against tile, on the sharp scent of disinfectant. Yet no matter how hard she tried, her eyes kept straying to Amara in the corner, her small hands clapping against the pot lid, her laughter rising like sunlight in the cold room. Naomi knew the sound would carry. She braced herself for the moment. When footsteps would approach, when someone, maybe Clara, as a strict house manager, or worse, Alexander himself would appear to question why a child was in the mansion. She imagined the scolding, the dismissal, the crushing words, "You're finished here," and yet she couldn't silence Amara's joy. For all her fear, Naomi felt something inside her shift. Watching her baby play on the cold marble, ribbon bobbing with every giggle, Naomi realized that even in this world of rigid wealth and rules, her daughter's laughter was alive, pure, and unstoppable. It was the only wealth she had, and she could not apologize for it. Naomi bent her head lower, gripping the mop tighter, telling herself to keep going, to endure, to finish the shift unseen. But life has a way of changing in a single heartbeat. At the far end of the corridor, she heard the quiet creak of a door opening. The sound of measured footsteps followed, deliberate and unhurried, echoing off the marble like the tick of a clock. Naomi froze, the mop dripping water onto the floor. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Breath caught in her chest. Mara's giggle rose again, louder this time, echoing through the silence of the grand hallway. Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears. Alexander Reed was awake early that morning, seeking the solitude of his home before the day's battles began. He had canceled meetings without explanation, craving the silence of familiar rooms that felt more like a museum than a home. But as he stepped into the living room, the sound that met him was not silence. It was laughter, the clear, unrestrained laughter of a child. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes locking on the small figure in the red ribbon, clapping her hands against a pot lid as though it were a toy drum. Naomi spun around, pale as marble, her mop forgotten. Her eyes pleaded silently, her lips trembling as if to form an apology. She knew this was the moment she had dreaded, the moment when everything might collapse. But Alexander did not speak right away. He stood there, coat draped over his arm, looking not at Naomi, but at the child on the floor. Something shifted in his expressions, something Naomi had never seen in all the whispers about him. Slowly, he set his coat aside, lowered himself onto one knee, and reached for a wooden block resting nearby.
"Oh?"
His voice, when it came, was gentle, almost foreign in the vast coldness of the mansion. "Hello there," he said softly, as if speaking to a fragile miracle. "May I play too?" The unexpected encounter. Alexander Reed had not planned to be home that morning. For years, his days followed a strict pattern. He would leave before sunrise, bury himself in numbers, contracts, and negotiations, and return only when the house was already steeped in silence. The estate had long become less of a home and more of a monument to discipline and control, a place where every room echoed with absence. Since the death of his wife, Elise, 3 years earlier, Alexander had lived as though emotions were dangerous, luxuries. He had trained himself to keep people at a distance, to ensure that vulnerability never threatened the order he had built. Yet something within him had shifted that morning, something he could not quite name. Instead of going to the office, he told his driver to stand down and wandered into the heart of his mansion as though searching for something he had lost. It was there, in the cold elegance of his living room, that he heard the laugh of a child. At first, Alexander thought he had imagined it, a ghost of memory echoing through his mind. But then it came again, bright and clear, a sound that cut through the silence like sunlight through a shutter. He stepped quietly forward, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor, and stopped at the threshold. What he saw there made him falter for the first time in years. On the polished floor, a small girl sat with a pot lid in her hands, banging it gently like a drum. Her eyes shone with unrestrained joy. and her ribbon red against the soft cream of her sweater caught the light in a way that seemed almost defiant against the room's sterile perfection. Alexander felt his chest tighten. He had not seen a child in this room since Elise passed away. The mansion had become a place stripped of laughter, where life was measured in appointments and silence reigned like a law. But this child, this little spark, seemed to bend the rules of the house without even knowing it. Naomi Carter, who stood frozen nearby, looked as though the world were collapsing around her. Her mop was still in hand, water dripping steadily. Onto the marble, her face pale with fear. She was caught between apology and desperation, her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes begging for mercy. She knew exactly what she had risked by bringing her daughter here. She could already imagine the accusations: unprofessional, careless, irresponsible. She braced herself for the dismissal that might follow, for the cruel certainty that the fragile balance of her life would shatter. But the dismissal never came. Instead, Alexander Reed did something no one in the house could have predicted. He set his coat aside on the arm of a chair, loosened the edge of his tie, and lowered himself slowly to one knee until he was eye level with the child. His tall frame, usually so imposing in boardrooms and negotiations, seemed to soften as he knelt, as though the act itself stripped away the armor he had built around his life. He reached for a wooden block lying abandoned on the floor and held it out, gently. "Hello there," he said, his voice calm and deliberate. "What's your name?" The little girl looked up, her eyes wide but curious. She didn't answer. Of course, at just over a year old, her world was still made mostly of sounds and gestures. But she giggled again, reaching out to grab the block from his hand, her tiny fingers wrapping around it with triumph. Alexander let out a slow breath, one he hadn't realized he was holding, and a smile flickered at the edges of his mouth, the first and longer than he could remember. Naomi's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to explain, to plead for understanding, but words refused to form. She finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling, "Her name is Amara." Alexander repeated it softly, as if tasting the syllables. Amara, a strong name. He glanced briefly at Naomi, his expression unreadable but not unkind, then returned his attention to the child. "Amara," he said again, slower this time. Letting the name rest in the quiet of the room, Naomi swallowed hard, her knuckles white. Around the mop handle. I'm sorry, sir," she began, forcing the words through the fear in her chest. "The daycare was closed today, and I couldn't find anyone else. I know I should never have brought her here. Please, just please, don't fire me. Find another way tomorrow, I promise." Alexander looked up at her, his eyes sharp but softened by something she hadn't expected. For years, Naomi had heard the rumors about him that he was ruthless, calculating, a man who valued order above all else. But in that moment, there was no ruthlessness in his gaze, only a quiet curiosity, though he were seeing something unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. "You were wrong to bring her without telling anyone," he said evenly, his voice carrying the weight of truth. Naomi's heart sank, her stomach twisting as she waited for the inevitable conclusion. But then he continued, and his words startled her. "But if this laughter has returned here because of that mistake, then perhaps it's the most beautiful mistake I've seen in a very long time." Naomi blinked, stunned. She wasn't sure she had heard correctly. Relief washed over her like a tide, but she held her breath, willing to believe fully until she saw what came next. Alexander shifted his posture, sitting more comfortably on the floor, and held out his pocket watch to Amara, a gold heirloom that usually never left his vest. The child reached for it eagerly, fascinated by its shine, turning it in her small hands with delight. Naomi's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. Overwhelmed by the strangeness of the moment, a powerful man, known for his distance and coldness, giggled. Kneeling on the marble floor while her daughter giggled in his presence, what Naomi could not see was the storm of memory unfolding inside Alexander. He remembered Elise, his late wife, laughing in this very room as she held her niece years ago. He remembered her saying that laughter was the only sound that made a house truly alive. For 3 years he had silenced that memory, burying it under work and discipline. And now, with this small child before him, it came rushing back with a force he could not ignore. From the kitchen doorway, Clara Mitchell, the house manager, paused, her eyes widening as she saw the scene. She had worked for the Reed family for over a decade and had never once witnessed Alexander kneel before anyone. She froze, unsure whether to intervene or retreat, her mind racing with the implications. Louise, the chef, peeked out from behind her shoulder, astonished, and in the garden outside, Jim Walker, the gardener, caught a glimpse through the window and smiled quietly, shaking his head in disbelief. Word of what they were seeing spread quickly, not through shouts but through whispers, the kind that carried weight heavier than any command. Naomi stood rooted to the spot, torn between fear and gratitude, not knowing what this moment meant for her future. She clutched her hands together, silently praying that this unexpected softness would last, so that the miracle unfolding before her would not dissolve when reality returned. Alexander, still focused on Amara, spoke again, his tone quieter now. "Go. On with your work, Naomi," he said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "I'll watch her for a few minutes." The words struck Naomi like lightning. He would watch her child. The man who demanded silence in every corner of his estate, who lived by schedules and control, was volunteering to sit on the floor with a baby while she worked. She felt tears sting her eyes again, but she turned quickly, not wanting him to see. She gripped her mop and returned to her task, her heart racing with emotions she could barely name. Behind her, the sound of her daughter's laughter filled the room, mixing with the quiet murmur of Alexander's voice as he entertained her with blocks and watches. For the first time since Naomi had entered the Reed estate months ago, the mansion felt less like a monument and more like a home. And, though Naomi could not yet know it, this was the moment that would change not just her life, but Alexander's as well. Asterisk. The house changes. The Reed estate had always been run with an almost military precision. The staff were accustomed to a rhythm that never shifted. Morning duties began at 6 sharp. Polished floors gleamed by 8, silverware aligned perfectly. Before lunch, and silence echoed through the grand halls like a second skin. Everyone knew their role, their boundaries, and their limits. Naomi, even in her short time there, had learned this better than most. She had kept her head down, moved quickly, and spoken only when necessary. Her place was in the margins, just like every other maid, cleaner, and cook. Yet that morning, something had cracked the rhythm, and everyone felt it. The story of what Clara Mitchell had seen in the living room spread quickly through the mansion. Not as gossip shouted across halls, but as whispers carried in cautious tones. Mr. Reed knelt down. He smiled at the child. He let her stay. These words floated between staff like sparks in dry grass, small but dangerous because they suggested something no one had imagined. Possible change. Naomi herself felt the shift most profoundly. She worked as though in a dream that day, her hands moving across counters and floors, but her mind still fixed on the image of Alexander Reed, sitting cross-legged on the marble while her daughter clapped her hands in delight. She replayed it over and over, half in disbelief, half in fear. Could it be real? Could the man so often described as cold, untouchable, and distant truly have softened in the presence of her little girl? She wanted to believe it, yet a part of her warned not to trust too quickly. She had lived too long on the edge of disappointment to surrender easily to hope. At midday, Naomi slipped into the kitchen to wipe down surfaces. Her daughter still in the corner, dozing in her blanket. She reached up to a high shelf for a clean towel when her hand brushed against a tin box painted with daisies. Curious, she pulled it down carefully, wiped off the thin layer of dust, and opened the lid. Inside were several notebooks bound in worn fabric, their edges yellowed with time. The first one bore a name written in delicate cursive. Elise read. Naomi paused, her breath catching. She knew the name, of course everyone did. Elise had been Alexander's wife, the woman who once filled this mansion with life and warmth. Until illness took her too soon, the house had never recovered from her absence. The silence that followed was like a shroud. Slowly, Naomi opened the notebook and turned the pages. What she found was not the sterile account book she expected, but recipes, simple ones, written with little notes in the margins. Add cinnamon when the air feels heavy. Always cut the cake warm and share it before silence returns. These were not just instructions for food, or fragments of a philosophy, reminders that kitchens were not merely for feeding the body, but for nurturing the spirit. Naomi's heart tightened as she read, imagining the woman who had once written these words in the warmth of the same kitchen where she now stood. For reasons she could not fully explain, Naomi felt compelled to follow one of the recipes. She gathered flour, butter, sugar, and oranges from the pantry, moving carefully so as not to draw attention. She measured precisely, following Elise's instructions down to the smallest detail, her hands steady, her mind oddly calm. As the oven warmed, the scent of citrus and butter began to drift through the kitchen, filling the space with a sweetness it had not known in years. It was then that Alexander returned, his sleeves rolled up, tie loosened as though the morning's encounter had stripped away his usual armor. He stopped in the doorway, closing his eyes briefly as the aroma washed over him. "I thought I was imagining it," he said softly. "The house. It smells alive again." Naomi turned quickly, startled to see him there, but he did not look at her with judgment. Instead, he stepped forward, pulled out a chair at the kitchen island, and sat down, his tall frame folding into a posture that looked almost ordinary. "What are you making?" he asked. She hesitated, unsure if she had overstepped by touching Elise's belongings. "It's from her book," Naomi admitted, her voice quiet. "I found it on the shelf. Orange pound cake." Ow. She waited for the reprimand, the accusation that she had invaded private memories. But Alexander simply nodded, his eyes softening. "Elise loved that one," he murmured. For a moment, silence hung between them, but it was not the cold silence that usually haunted the house. It was warmer, layered with memory. Alexander reached out and touched the edge of the notebook with careful fingers, tracing the handwriting. As though he were touching her hand again, the oven chimed softly, and Naomi pulled out the cake, golden and fragrant. She cut 2 thick slices, sprinkling them with powdered sugar, and placed one in front of Alexander. He lifted his fork, took a bite, and closed his eyes. For a brief instant, it was as if Elise's laughter had passed through the room again, a ghost not of sorrow, but of comfort. When he opened his eyes, he looked at Naomi differently, as though she were no longer just a maid, but someone who had managed to awaken something long buried. "This house has been too quiet for too long," he said at last. "Perhaps it's time it remembered how to live." Naomi felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to thank him, to tell him what it meant for her daughter and for herself. But words seemed too fragile for the weight of the moment. Instead, she simply nodded, her eyes shining. From the doorway, Clara lingered again, her usual stern expression softened with something almost like approval. Louise, the chef, inhaled deeply, smiling at the familiar warmth of baked citrus. And Jim, outside tending the roses, lifted his head as the scent drifted through the open window. The estate, for the first time in years, hummed with the beginnings of life. It was not just cake, it was not just a child's laughter, it was the slow unraveling of a silence that had imprisoned them all. And though Naomi did not yet know it, the small act of baking from Elise's book had set into motion changes far larger than she could imagine. For in the coming days, the heart of the Reed estate would no longer be the marble halls or the polished offices. It would be the kitchen, where warmth and memory wove themselves into something new. Asterisk. The storm arrives. The days that followed felt unlike any Naomi had ever known inside the Reed estate. The mansion that had once been so sterile, echoing with silence, began to feel like it had a pulse again. The staff, once rigid and wary, found themselves speaking in softer tones, even laughing in small bursts when Amara's giggles rang through the halls. Louise in the kitchen sometimes slipped an extra cookie onto a plate for the baby.
Ow!
Jim, the gardener, began leaving sprigs of lavender by the kitchen door, claiming it would help her sleep. Clara, though still composed and precise, paused longer each morning as she walked past Naomi, as if silently acknowledging that something extraordinary was happening. For the first time since Elise Reed's passing, the house felt alive with more than duty. It felt alive with humanity. At the center of it all stood Alexander Reed, though even he hardly recognized the man he was becoming. He found himself lingering at home instead of rushing to the office. He discovered that he could spend an entire half-hour crouched on the living room carpet, stacking blocks with Amara, or letting her tug at the chain of his pocket watch. He discovered that Naomi's voice, steady but soft, filled the silence in ways he had not realized he needed. She did not chatter unnecessarily, but when she spoke, her words carried warmth and honesty. She reminded him of Elise in that way, practical, grounded, but with a heart that seemed to know exactly how to bring comfort where it was most needed. Yet, as with all shifts in life, the change did not go unnoticed, and not everyone welcomed it. Victoria Hale, Alexander's longtime business partner and the woman society had long assumed would become his fiancée, began hearing whispers. She had always cared less about Alexander himself than about the image of being aligned with him. The perfect pair. Powerful, wealthy, invulnerable. For her, appearances were everything. The Reed estate had symbolized that image, a place where no flaws were visible, no disruptions allowed. When news reached her that a maid's child was wandering the halls, that Alexander had been seen not only tolerating it but actively joining in play. Her carefully maintained mask cracked with fury. Victoria arrived unannounced one late afternoon. The mansion's front gates opened to her sleek car, and her heels clicked sharply on the polished floors as she entered, her presence slicing through the fragile warmth that had begun to build. Naomi in the kitchen froze as the sound of those heels echoed closer. Carrying with them an authority, Naomi recognized instantly the authority of someone who believed the house was hers to control. Alexander was in the kitchen that day, his jacket set aside, his sleeves rolled up as he poured coffee into 2 cups. Naomi stood nearby, trying to keep her composure while slicing the last of the orange pound cake that had quickly become a quiet ritual between them. Amara, drowsy after a nap, sat on a blanket in the corner, clutching a wooden spoon as though it were treasure. The door swung open, and Victoria stepped inside. Her blazer was immaculate, her hair pulled into a sharp twist, and her perfume announced her presence even before her words did. Her eyes swept across the scene in a single glance. Alexander at the kitchen island, coffee cup set for 2, a cake dusted with sugar, made with her daughter in the corner. The sight struck her as a betrayal, not of romance, for she had never truly loved Alexander, but of order of image, the flawless reputation she had worked alongside him to cultivate. "What is this?" she asked, her voice cool but edged with steel. Naomi's hands trembled around the knife, and she lowered her gaze, prepared for the storm. Alexander, however, did not flinch. He set the coffee pot down, looked Victoria directly in the eyes, and said simply, "This is my home." Victoria's lips tightened. "Your home? Or is it becoming a daycare now? A place where staff bring their children and play house while you abandon your position as a leader? Do you have any idea what people will say if they see this?" Alexander leaned back slightly, his expression calm but unyielding. "People will say what they will. But for the first time in years, this house doesn't feel like a tomb. That comes at the cost of appearances, then so be it." Victoria's eyes flicked toward Naomi, narrowing with disdain. "And you?" she said sharply, her tone cutting like glass. "You think this is appropriate? To bring your child here? To insert yourself into spaces where you don't belong?" Naomi's throat closed, but before she could speak, Alexander interrupted. No. His voice was steady, commanding, but not raised. "Enough. Naomi works here with more integrity than most executives I know. And as for her daughter, she has brought something back into this house that it desperately needed." The words shocked everyone, even Naomi. Her heart pounded, torn between gratitude and fear. She had never imagined he would defend her so openly. Not against a woman as powerful and connected as Victoria, but Alexander's tone left no room for doubt. Victoria's cheeks flushed, her control slipping. "You're throwing away everything we built. One photograph, just one of you holding that child, and years of work will unravel. Investors don't want sentimentality. They want strength. Alexander held her gaze without blinking. Then, perhaps they've misunderstood strength. Strength isn't pretending to be untouchable. It's remembering what makes us human. If laughter in this kitchen is seen as weakness, then maybe I've been strong in the wrong ways. The silence that followed was heavy. Naomi kept her eyes fixed on the countertop, afraid to breathe too loudly. Amara, unaware of the tension, banged her spoon lightly on the blanket and giggled, the sound ringing through the air like defiance. Victoria turned on her heel, her heels clicking like gunshots across the floor. "This is a mistake," she said coldly. "And when the world sees it, you'll regret it." She swept out of the room, leaving behind only the sharp scent of her perfume and the echo of her words. Naomi finally exhaled, her shoulders sagging with relief and fear mingled together. She bent to pick up her daughter, holding Amara close, as though to shield her from the storm that had just passed. Alexander, however, reached across the counter and tapped the open recipe book softly. "Keep cooking," he said, his voice gentler now. "Keep rocking her when she cries. Keep doing what you do best. I'll handle the rest." Naomi met his eyes then, truly met them. And for the first time since she had started working at the Reed estate, she no longer felt invisible. She felt seen, defended, and perhaps most miraculous of all, respected. Outside, Clara, who had stood silently in the hallway, allowed herself the faintest of smiles before returning to her duties. Louise hummed quietly as she kneaded dough, her hands moving with more life than usual. Jim in the garden began planting new lavender beds. Certain the house itself was changing from the ground up, but Naomi knew the storm was not over. Victoria's words were not idle threats. The world outside would soon hear of what had happened in the Reed estate, and when it did, the true test of Alexander's resolve and Naomi's courage would begin. The gesture that changed lives the storm Victoria left behind did not fade quietly. Within days, the whispers inside the Reed estate spilled beyond its marble walls and into the wider world. A gardener mentioned something innocently at the market. A chef's cousin repeated what she had heard over Sunday dinner. A single photograph taken by a staff member who could not resist capturing the impossible sight of Alexander. Reed kneeling on the floor beside a laughing child found its way onto social media. At first, it appeared like nothing more than a curiosity, the reclusive millionaire with a baby in his arms. But as the image spread, curiosity turned into fascination. The photograph was simple yet powerful. Alexander, usually so untouchable in perfectly tailored suits, seated on the carpet, his tie loosened, his hair slightly out of place. In his arms rested Amara, clutching his pocket watch with innocent delight, her little ribbon gleaming. Like a crown against the sterile background of the mansion, his expression, softer than anyone had ever seen, carried none of the cold authority that the business world knew so well. Instead, he looked almost human. The caption under the shared post read, "Even the strongest walls fall to laughter." What followed shocked everyone, especially Victoria. The image did not damage Alexander's reputation, it elevated it. People were hungry, it seemed, not for perfection but for humanity. In a world of cold press releases and polished facades, the sight of a powerful man rediscovering warmth struck a chord. Within days, newspapers carried the photo on their front pages, with headlines that painted Alexander not as a scandal, but as a symbol, the millionaire who remembered how to feel. From silence to laughter, Reed Estate's unexpected revival. What a baby taught a billionaire. Inside the mansion, Naomi's world turned upside down. She had braced for the worst dismissal, humiliation, perhaps even being cast out without a word of thanks. Instead, she found herself at the heart of a story that was changing not only her life, but the culture of the estate itself. Staff who once looked past her now stopped to smile, to ask about Amara, to share in small ways the warmth the child brought. Clara, who had always carried herself with unshakable discipline, was quietly arranged for a small room near the kitchen to be converted into a safe nap space. It's complete with a crib and soft blankets, so Amara would no longer need to rest. On the cold floor, Louise began baking from Elise's recipe books more often, filling the mansion with scents of orange, cinnamon, and warm bread. Even Jim, whose rough hands usually only touched soil and roses, carved a small wooden toy in his spare time and shyly presented it to Amara one morning. For Naomi, it felt like living inside a miracle, one she could hardly bring herself to believe. She still worked tirelessly, polishing and scrubbing and carrying out every duty expected of her. But now she did so with a strange new lightness. She was no longer invisible. Her daughter was no longer a burden hidden in the shadows. Somehow, part of the rhythm of the house. The greatest change, however, came from Alexander himself. The man who had once lived by schedules and silence began rewriting the rules of his own home. Meetings that had once consumed his mornings were shortened so he could linger over coffee in the kitchen. Calls that once stretched into the night were rescheduled so he could sit for a few minutes and watch Amara crawl across the rug. Staff, though astonished, quickly adapted. They realized this was not weakness. It was transformation. For years, they had served a house that felt like a mausoleum, haunted by Elise's absence. Now, for the first time, the house felt alive again, and they were part of its renewal. Still, Alexander knew the storm was not entirely behind them. Victoria continued her campaign, trying to frame Naomi as an opportunist, suggesting Alexander had lost his focus, warning investors that sentimentality would ruin his empire. But when he stood before the board at Reed Holdings to address the rumors, Alexander did something no one expected. He leaned into the truth. Yes, he said, standing tall at the head of the long table, his voice carrying with quiet authority. A maid brought her daughter to my house when she had no choice. And yes, I chose to sit on the floor and play with that child, because in that laughter, I was reminded of what every business, every empire, and every life is truly for not. The cold pursuit of perfection, but the warmth of humanity. If any of you believe compassion makes me weaker, then you do not understand the foundation of strength. Silence followed his words, but it was not the silence of disapproval. It was the silence of respect. One by one, the members of the board nodded, some even smiling faintly, as though relieved to see a leader who dared to be human. Victoria, seeing her influence slipping, left the meeting with fury burning in her eyes. Da 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 da! But the tide had turned, and Alexander would not be swayed. That evening, he returned to the mansion and made a decision that would forever alter the lives of those within its walls. He gathered the staff in the grand kitchen, where the scent of Elise's orange cake still lingered, and spoke to them not as an untouchable master, but as a man who had rediscovered his heart. This house has lived too long in silence. It has been a place of rules, of distance, of perfection, without warmth. That ends now. From this day forward, this estate will not only serve as my home, it will serve as a place where family is honored, no matter whose family it is. I want one wing of the house converted into a daycare, a space where children of staff can be cared for while their parents work. No one should ever be forced to choose between their livelihood and their child. The staff stared in stunned silence, their eyes wide. Naomi felt tears spill down her cheeks before she could stop them. She clutched Amara to her chest, her heart pounding with gratitude and disbelief. Alexander continued, his voice steady but filled with conviction. Naomi Carter will oversee it. Her compassion and dedication have already changed this house. I want her to lead this effort, to ensure that no one who works here feels the fear she once carried. Naomi's knees nearly buckled. She had never imagined such words could be spoken about her, a maid who had once felt invisible, disposable, replaceable. To be trusted with responsibility, to be given dignity, to be recognized as more than just a cleaner, it was more than she had ever dared hope for. From that day forward, the Reed estate transformed. The wing near the garden was renovated, filled with bright rugs, shelves of toys, and small cribs. Staff brought their children, who played together under Naomi's gentle supervision. The sound of laughter became the new music of the mansion, echoing through halls once known only for their silence. Alexander himself often wandered in, kneeling down among the children, rediscovering joy in their unfiltered innocence. For Naomi, life was no longer a desperate balancing act between survival and love. It was a life with purpose, dignity, Hope she still worked hard, but now she worked with her head held high, her daughter at her side, and the knowledge that compassion could alter even the coldest of destinies. And for Alexander, the mansion was no longer a monument to loss. It was a living home once again, a place where Elisa's memory did not haunt him, but guided him. Her recipes and notes reminding him daily that love was meant to be shared. The millionaire's gesture had not only changed Naomi and Amara's lives, it had changed his own, and in time, it rippled outward, touching everyone who crossed the threshold of the Reed estate. The world outside could argue, could speculate, could whisper about images and reputations, but inside those walls, the truth was simple. Laughter had returned, and with it, life itself. Naomi often thought back to that first morning when she had carried her daughter onto the bus, terrified of what the day would bring. She had whispered, "Mama's here, love. We'll get through today." She had believed it only half then, clinging to hope as if it were a fragile thread. But now, looking around the transformed estate, hearing her daughter's laughter blend with the voices of other children, seeing Alexander smile with a warmth that reached his eyes, she realized that hope had never been fragile. It had only needed a chance to breathe, and so, in the most unexpected of places, it was a mansion of marble and glass. A kitchen warmed by orange pound cake. A millionaire's heart rediscovered through a maid's courage. A new story was written. A story where compassion triumphed over image, where strength was measured not by distance, but by closeness, and where one humble gesture changed countless lives.